Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. We will get started in about 2 minutes. Greetings, everyone. My name is Nisha Singh, and I'm the Social Norms Technical Lead for FinEquity. Welcome to our first webinar for 2020. We're very excited to start this year with a webinar that has a stellar lineup of speakers. Today, we're going to talk about understanding women's rural transition and service needs, opportunities for financial service providers. We have Annie and Clara from the Rural and Agricultural Finance Learning Lab, and Jasmine from AgDevCo, and Katie from Root Capital, who will be sharing a little bit of their work with us shortly. Before we get started, I just want to take a minute to remind you of a few things if you have not joined these webinars before. You can type your questions at the bottom in the chat box and send it to everyone. Have time for Q&A after all the presentations. You can send your questions as you listen to the presentations, and then direct them to our speakers. There will be a poll at some point during the presentation, and you'll see an pop-up. So you select your answer, so pay attention. And the slides and the recording will be shared after the event. So you will be able to go back and listen or refer to anything you need to. Finally, as FinEquity, we are conducting an annual survey of our members, and I'll share the link in the chat box, and you should be able to take the survey. So it doesn't take very long. We would really appreciate your feedback. So please do take for that. All right, with those housekeeping notes out of the way, I'm going to now get started with the webinar. So the recently published Pathways to Prosperity report from the Rural Ag Finance Learning Lab was really interesting in the way it presented information on customer segmentation, and the accompanying gender deep dive provided some really useful, I think, framing of how we need to look at this women's segment differently, which is what Clara and Annie will talk to us about. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Clara.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nisha, and welcome everyone. I am Clara Colina, I'm Program Manager for MasterCard Foundation Rural Agricultural Finance Learning Lab, and I am joined here by my colleague Anne, who will also be diving a bit deeper into some of the implications of the pathways framework that I'll introduce in a couple of minutes for women in particular. Anne and I are both co-authors of the Gender Deep Dive piece, and are really excited to share some of those insights today, as well as having Jasmine and Katie as to share the examples of what financial service providers are doing in terms of better serving women in some of the rural transition pathways we'll be looking at in a minute. So thank you, everyone. I think we'll be, Nisha, correct me if I'm wrong, but we'll be pausing at the end for Q&A. And in the meantime, we'll encourage you to use the chat to start posting your questions as they come to mind.
Yes, afterwards.
Wonderful. Okay, so as Nisha was saying, we released in Q4 2019, we released the latest state of the rural and agricultural finance report called Pathways to Prosperity. And if we can move one slide down. So just before we dive in, as a bit of introduction, this report is sponsored by ourselves, MasterCard Foundation Rural and Agricultural Finance Learning Lab. We are the dedicated learning partner for MasterCard's Foundation 170 million portfolio in rural and agricultural finance in sub-Saharan Africa. We sponsor this jointly with the IS, who's an advisory group that is primarily working on supporting organizations in designing investment structures, but also has a big public learning good component around research for the sector. How do I move forward? Oh, there you go. It's Nisha, okay. Sorry. So just to give you a bit of context, we've been doing these state of the sector reports for some years now. The state of the sector reports are an opportunity to take a stock of the market and keep pushing the agenda for rural and ag finance forward. It started in 2012, actually driven by Tolberg. At the time, neither ISF advisors nor ourselves existed. It was one of the key outcomes of that report was the design of both of these two initiatives. More recently, in 2016, and as many of you might be familiar, we published Inflection Point. The biggest thing there was primarily the market sizing and a call to action around the opportunity of closing the smallholder finance gap. Pathway to Prosperity builds on Inflection Point. Is the one that we've released in 2019, and the one we'll be focusing on today, and tries to rally stakeholders not only around some updated state of the sector numbers, but primarily around new frameworks that can help us think a bit more strategically about the rural and ag finance market. So if we just move one slide forward, the report, I think if you haven't had a chance to interact with it, you can download the full PDF in our website, or you can actually use our microsite, which is a much more interactive way of engaging with the research at pathwaysraflearning.org. It's basically structured around 5 different sections. A first section that focuses on the market sizing, so really sizing the demand and supply for rural finance. Then there's a couple of innovative frameworks that we've introduced, the rural pathway models that really reconceptualizes how we've been thinking about clients, smallholder clients today. Then a new service delivery model technology that redefines how we think about providers, and then trying to lay out the implications of these two models for micro level decision making, so primarily investment decision making, and then macro level decision making around broader rural ag transformation. Today, we're going to focus just on the rural pathways model. So I'm going to introduce a bit the model, and then what we're going to do is actually have a discussion on the implications of the rural pathways model to serve women. So there's a lot more information online, but we're going to be focusing on the pathways model. So just before I hand it over to my colleague, Anne, I wanted to introduce the rural pathways model that we've laid out in Pathways to Prosperity. So as a bit of context, before we dig into this diagram, one of the greatest push forward that we've seen in the market lately is stakeholders really rethinking how we categorize smallholder farmers. So in the past, we were basically thinking about smallholder households in a very simple way, primarily by the land size, the crop that they were involved, or the links to the value chain. And this gave rise to the very well-known CGAP segmentation. We also used an inflection point around subsistence farmers, smallholder farmers in tight commercial tight value chains and commercial loose value chains. In the past year, we've seen a wealth of data being gathered from rural households, primarily from CGAP around the smallholder farmer diaries and the national representative surveys for rural households, which has really allowed us to get a much more granular view on the social and economic behavior of this rural household. But even then, when we started doing this research, what we noticed is that we were categorizing rural households still in a very static way. So basically trying to categorize them based on the characteristics in a particular point in time. When in reality, these rural households, as any of our own households, are dynamic, and they change as their goals and the challenges they face evolve over time. So to capture that dynamism, we developed the rural pathways models, which tries to map the different transition pathways that rural households may walk through over their lifetime as they pursue increased resilience, agency, and face new challenges and change the evolving in the goals that they pursue over time. The rural pathways models is anchored around what we call 4 centers of gravity. The first one there towards the left-hand side, farming as a business. So these are rural households that remain in rural areas and primary production. And as you see, there's several different pathways there, everything from a very vulnerable subsistent farmer who's farming for family, is not linked to value chains, does not perceive farming as a business, transitioning to a bit of more resilient subsistence farmers, achieving new some improved levels of resilience through social network, public transfers, etc. Then moving to an intensified commercializing farmer, so a farmer that is now farming as a business and it's engaging on the first stages of intensification through improved inputs use, some early stages of mechanization, etc. All the way to the consolidated commercializing farmers, so getting into bigger farms through the consolidation of land and more sophisticated farming operations, and then finally all the way up to enterprise organizations characterized primarily by a higher degree of formalization. Second, a center of gravity towards the right is the rural service entrepreneurship. So these are those households that still remain in rural areas, but pursue an entrepreneurship strategy, livelihood strategy. And that could be in both agricultural services, so small processors, traders, aggregators, etc. Or it could be non-ag related, little mom and pop shop, mobile agents, etc. Keeping moving towards the right, we have the rural labor. So these are those households and individuals that still remain in rural areas, but are not involved in either primary production or entrepreneurship, but rather are employment that is supporting the combination of products and services that are delivered in the rural areas. And lastly, towards the end of the right-hand side, pretty self-explanatory, the urban migration. So some rural households with enough push and pull factors will transition into an urban setting. Just a couple of notes there. These transitions can be both upwards and backwards, even if the arrows only here look upwards or towards the right. When hit with climate shocks, with market shocks, or with other social challenges, as Anne will dive into in a minute, they can actually we can actually go backwards in that transition as well. And finally, the other thing to note here is that we shouldn't see these pathways like isolated compartments. We actually find a lot of rural households involved in multiple pathways, and whether that is at the during multiple pathways at different times of the year, given if there's different seasons, and when there's not, when their crop is not in season, they might go into another pathway, or even they're playing in multiple pathways at the same time. And this is particularly prominent in some segments like youth, but also in gender and in women, as Anne will explain in a minute. So before we go into seeing how this differs for women, I would like to make a quick poll question to get a sense of how this is, how you're perceiving and how this training is resonating with you. So the question is, in which pathway do you think are women more likely to face the most difficulties transitioning? And in the interest of trying to be a bit picky, let's limit to the top two choices.
So everyone should see the poll, and we'll give it 30 more seconds. Okay, I'm going to close the poll now. All right, you can see the results. I think we have land consolidation and transition to formal enterprise as the highest, closely followed by developing a resilience buffer.
Wonderful. I'm not sure if others can see the results. We can't, at least in our end, but that's very helpful. So thank you, Nisha, for sharing those results. I think I mean, bottom line, and we'll talk a bit more about this. And while each pathway, it's the dynamics, the gender dynamics that we see within each pathways are very different. The reality is that there's no a right or wrong answer here. And as Anne will walk us through right now, each pathway faces a distinct set of challenges for women, although we do see a gap widening in some of them. Actually, I think as the poll is pointing, land consolidation is one of the highest, as well as farm intensification and transition to formal enterprise. But the main message here is the transition is hard across the board for all pathways. So with that, I'll let my colleague Anne, who's gonna more focusing.
Yeah, thanks, Clara. So I think the headline of our gender deep dive is really that in theory, rural women will have the same transition pathways as men, but in practice, and as we've alluded to in our poll, we're likely to see a higher concentration of women in certain pathways, and also the rate at which they can transition between pathways will be different. And that's because rural women face a really wide range of constraints and structural challenges that arise from the context in which they live. And in our gender deep dive, we break down these constraints into three buckets or three categories. These are educational constraints, sociocultural constraints, and also legal barriers. So when it comes to educational constraints, we know that women on average have lower levels of educational attainment than men. And the global evidence is clear that educational constraints have a negative consequence on both the breadth of options and the quality of remunerative opportunities that young women can pursue, young women and women in general can pursue both on and off the farm. Then sociocultural norms we know affect both men and women in the sense that they have an influence on choices that men and women can make. Especially for women, social norms can have a profound effect on the type of economic activities they can engage in. It also has an influence on the people or agencies they can interact with, the time they might have available in the day, the places they can go. And then finally, laws and regulations can also heavily influence what women get access to in the economy. So the average economy only gives women 3/4 of the rights of men. And I think the example that comes up most often, at least in the agricultural finance sector, is that of land rights and inheritance laws. In many, many countries still, men get prioritized over women when it comes to ownership of land and inheritance. So these constraints make it a lot harder for women to access education, access entrepreneurship or employment opportunities, and also financial services, which then influences their ability to move through these pathways and transition. But I think what we also wanted to note in our deep dive is that a narrow focus on just the differences between men and women often masks more important differences between women, including those that arise as they transition through various life stages. So in our report, we also outline a typical rural woman's life stages, and we identify key transition points in those life stages that have the potential to stall or change her trajectory within the transition pathways. So we're not going to go into detail into each one of these life stages, but just to give you an example, if we consider young adulthood, this is a really critical time for young women. And that's because they're entering secondary school, but it's also because it's around this time that young women start to get pushed into early marriage and pregnancy. And often this is because of financial reasons. So especially in times of shock or crisis, households may choose to marry girls off because it means fewer mouths to feed. The secondary education is really a critical link between primary school and the labor market. And skipping secondary education limits a woman's ability to accumulate human capital and also productive assets. And there's a lot of evidence that shows that lower educational attainment levels are correlated with lower access to agricultural resources and assets. And what this means is that ultimately, girls who are married earlier are more likely to remain in poverty along with their entire families. So if we go to the next slide, we put all of these things together. If we take into account structural constraints, we also layer on top of that life stage transitions and disruptions, it means that women lead fundamentally different economic lives than men. And this means that they need to be served differently. And so what we do in our gender deep dive is that we break down the gender specific dynamics that we as a sector need to consider when designing interventions for women within each pathway. So we're not, again, going to go into every single pathway, but just to give you an example, if we look at pathway number 2, and as a reminder, this is the pathway where farmers are taking a business-oriented approach to farming, and they're able to start generating surplus and increase their production value. If we think about women within this pathway, we expect to see the gender gap widen as smallholders move into more intensified agricultural activity. And the reason for this is that intensification relies heavily on access to productive assets, access to certain technologies, and also consistent access to markets, all of which are particularly challenging for women. And on top of that, women's limited rate of land ownership or access to land to farm on also prevents them from accessing finance that often is collateral based. So service delivery models or interventions, if they're designed in gender sensitive ways, can help women in this pathway increase their role in commercial production and crop diversification, and can also help women secure autonomous access to land or usage of land. But in order for that to happen, women need financial services that help them mitigate against economic shocks, and they also need financial and non-financial services that are adapted for their specific constraints. And we go in a little bit deeper into the deep dive with specific examples, but just to name a few for the webinar today, this can include loans with flexible collateral and KYC requirements. It can also, for example, mean credit that's bundled with insurance. Other types of services that can really unlock opportunities for women are market access services that take into account their specific time and mobility constraints. And then another example is leased or shared models of mechanization. If we move to the next slide, I think one of the conclusions that we offer in our deep dive is that for women to participate equally and derive equal benefit from markets, service delivery models mustn't just stop at sort of trying to overcome barriers that limit women's access to and control over resources, but we must also aim to create opportunities for women to build resilient livelihoods. And so in our deep dive, we highlight several approaches that we see emerging in the sector. So these are, for example, capacity building approaches like training or mentorship programs that help address the human capital gap. We're seeing service adaptation approaches where products or services are either designed or tailored to fit with women's specific needs. Collective action approaches that enable women to circumvent constraints that they might meet as individuals. Shared dialogue approaches that help challenge powerful gender dynamics within the household or within communities. Gender-based affirmative action approaches to counterbalance or overcome some of the structural biases that are inherent in certain systems. And then finally, policy-related or enabling environment initiatives that help drive structural transformation. Another one of the conclusions in our deep dive is that despite the fact that gender inequality has received a growing amount of attention and investment in recent years, we've seen considerable progress that's been made on certain aspects of the global development agenda, the global financial inclusion gender gap has continued to persist. There's been no change in the financial inclusion gender gap between 2014 and 2015. And I think partly this is because we're not seeing a lot of approaches that tackle some of the underlying drivers of gender inequality. And we're not seeing a lot of approaches that contribute to transformative change in women's status as economic actors. And part of this is because this requires a really nuanced understanding of women's constraints. And so what we're hoping to do through this gender deep dive is to offer guidance to various actors in the sector to push them to take a more holistic view. So the starting point is this pathway, rural transition pathway model. And so it's really about identifying which pathway and which transitions are women pursuing. Then we need to start acknowledging some of the structural constraints that might affect women's ability to get to that transition point. And then layer on top of that life stage considerations that might add additional disruptions or obstacles to women's ability to get there. And so if we take all of those things together as a sector, we can better understand how to deliver services that help women transition successfully between pathways. So I think we're going to leave it at that for now, but we're going to pass the mic over to two speakers that are going to share some examples that hopefully can bring some of this framework to life.
Hi, this is Yasmin. I think Nisha may have gotten disconnected for just a moment, so if you could let me know whom to pass the mic to, I can help her out with that.
Sure, you're going to pass the mic to Jasmine Agdevko.
So I've passed the mic to Jasmine.
Thanks. Can you hear me?
But we cannot see your screen, Jasmine. I do see that Nisha is back, and if everyone will bear with me for just 2 moments, I will give her some rights so that she can help us out with that. But if you want to go ahead and get started, Jasmine, please do so. There's a lot of breathing sounds, by the way, so please adjust, the distance of your mic. Thanks.
All right, great. So, well, just checking if you can hear me now clearly.
Yes, thank you.
Great. All right, so while Nisha puts the slides onto the screen, let me just start off by giving some context on where gender sits within AgDevco and the Smallholder Development Unit, or SDU as I will refer to it. So AgDevco is an impact investor operating exclusively in the agriculture sector in sub-Saharan Africa. And although gender issues are not the primary purpose of AgDevco's investments, AgDevco believes that gender equality and women's empowerment are significant factors in the success of its investments. And hence, AgDevco's intention is to undertake investments into agribusinesses which do no harm and safeguard both women and men, as well as create beneficial outcomes for both women and men. And AgDevco's SDU aims to connect 25 agribusinesses to 490,000 smallholders. And it aims to de-risk relationships between agribusinesses and smallholder farmers. And it funds agribusinesses that work with large numbers of smallholder farmers typically. So the SDU has a specific target to reach 50% women farmers. And to date, we have reached 45% women, which represents around 100,000 women that are receiving ongoing training and that are being linked to markets. If we move to the next slide, the first initiative I would like to highlight is on using video training as a tool to empower women. Women farmers contribute a lot to farm labor, and it is important that they receive training directly rather than assuming that a male head of household will pass down the information to them. In addition to helping make traditional extension services more effective, the SDU also uses innovative technologies to deliver agronomic training in different ways that engage farmers and that reach farmers that otherwise might not be reached. In particular, the SDU uses video training, and the technology you see here on the screen is quite simple, cost-effective, and suitable for rural areas. We use the TV screens pictured here, which can be inserted into a padded backpack and can then be transported by an extension officer on a bike or a motorbike to bring the training to the farmers themselves. These TV screens can be used during the day as well, for example, under the shade of a tree. And we also provide video training via mobile phones, which you see pictured here as well. And these are typically owned by or provided to lead farmers in order to share the training with other farmers in their community. So we typically work with videographers and editors to develop videos in the local language, and the videos are typically between 3 to 5 minutes. Once they've been developed, the extension staff of the agribusiness goes to the field, tells the community what the training is about, shows the video, and afterwards there's a Q&A session. But we note that it's important to still have boots on the ground, even when using technology, to really ensure that farmers have the opportunity to ask questions. If we go to the next slide. Thank you. The picture here shows a video training that is delivered via smartphone owned by a lead farmer in rural northern Mozambique, where I was 2 weeks ago to see the implementation of the training on the ground. It's really important to ensure the training is held at a time and place that is convenient for women to attend. Whether it's via screenings on TVs at the community level or through mobile phones, video training is an effective method to increase access to training, in particular for women who, due to their domestic responsibilities, have mobility constraints. Video training is also a great way to increase retention of key messages and to engage farmers. And by focusing on visuals, video training also enables to circumvent literacy constraints, which are often more prevalent amongst women in rural communities, and lead to women either not attending training or not understanding training material. The actors in the videos are community members themselves, which helps the audience to engage with the content as they recognize community members and see the training as more relevant if it's one of them providing the explanation. We also include female role models in the videos to demonstrate that women's roles in the production process are recognized and that a woman can also be a good farmer that is worth listening to for advice. And this in turn helps to gradually shift social norms. We generally notice that women are very engaged in video training. And in Mozambique, this was demonstrated through their contributions and the questions they asked during the Q&A session. This is noteworthy because typically the social norm is that women do not speak in these settings, and Q&A sessions are often dominated by men. However, the video training enabled women to engage more with the content, and both women and men ask questions. And it's important to know that at trainings, it's actually important to encourage women to ask questions and express their views. And having a gender balanced training team can help with this. When we tested the participants on the training material, women were able to give the correct answer and they showed a good retention of key messages. A detail that is worth noting as well is that we used local music in the video that actually made the local women dance, and it really engaged them. So we started off with a group of 10 or so farmers, but as the tune was playing, more and more farmers joined the sessions as they were intrigued by this new form of training. And this is a great way to reach farmers that you otherwise would not reach. So overall, if we go to the next slide, we are quite pleased with the outcome of video trainings, and we are commissioning a study to compare the effectiveness of this methodology to traditional forms of extension services. So to summarize, by adapting agronomic training to women's needs and bringing training to women in a visual manner, we've improved the access to information by addressing mobility, time, and literacy constraints, which enables women to start using good agricultural practices, which can help close the gender productivity gap, which according to FAO sits at about 20 to 30%. The second initiative that I would like to talk about on the next slide is about farming as a family business and household budgeting training. Even in male-dominated value chains, where it seems that women don't cultivate the crop, women typically contribute significantly to farm labor. But women often lack visibility within the supply chain, and their work is often unacknowledged or undervalued. The SDU promotes farming as a family business as a way to ensure that women become more visible in supply chains, and also to get more agency and decision-making power within the household, and to ensure that women and children benefit from the income derived from agricultural production. Even in traditionally female-dominated value chains, it is important to promote farming as a family business, as men may start to take over the value chain once it becomes profitable. Household budgeting training often includes participatory household methodologies, such as the Gender Action Learning System, or GALS methodology, where households develop and literally draw a joint vision of where they want to be and identify the steps they need to take in order to get there. And these trainings are often provided by specialized NGOs. And the skills that are imparted through these trainings can range from entrepreneurial skills to record-keeping skills, business planning and budgeting skills, marketing, and risk management. We also work with our partners to develop inclusive outgrower strategies with KPIs they can track over time. And at the end of the presentation, I will guide you to some of our publications that provide further information on this. So farming as a family business helps to reduce the likelihood of backlash from men, which is a key point to make, because men may perceive women-only initiatives as discriminatory. So it helps to shift gendered power dynamics in a culturally sensitive way by including men throughout the process. It improves women's financial literacy as well and increases women's voice and agency by sharing the decision-making power within the household. And by involving both men and women in household budgeting, planning, and planning of farm activities, workloads could be shared more evenly and household conflicts about how income is spent could be reduced. And there's often some criticism that women's work is often more menial and hence may not be acknowledged by men as valuable. But the key point of this participatory approach is that it seeks to create an understanding of women's contribution to farm labor, and also that this contribution is crucial to the overall success of the farm's production. So I'd like to highlight a particular example of farming as family business in practice on the next slide. So here we see Naiti Aquiro in the middle with her husband Andrew and one of their sons. Naiti received financial literacy and agronomic training through a commodity buyer in northern Uganda supported by the SDU. And Nighty especially valued the training she received on financial planning and budgeting, which taught her how to budget and save money to invest in farming. But it also impacted her life beyond farming activities. Prior to the training, the household finances were completely controlled by her husband, whereas now Andrew and Nighty sit together to create a household budget, allocating sufficient fees to fund food purchases, farming inputs, as well as the school fees of their son. And this is a typical example of how a household methodology helps to engage men to acknowledge women's roles and to share decision-making power by giving women a voice. So this training in particular was provided through a Village Savings and Loan Association, VSLA, that was set up by the agribusiness that we partnered with. We recently conducted an evaluation, and some initial findings show that farmers that were able to save and borrow through the VSLA had improved marital relationships and reduced domestic violence. On the next slide, in particular, I'd like to show this anonymized quote from a female farmer, which shows some interesting gender dynamics at the household level. So she says, there is a better relationship between men and women in my community than there was 3 years ago. Previously, men did not support the idea of their wives joining VSLA groups because of the fear that they would have more money and would disrespect their husbands. But currently, most men have seen the benefits of being in a VSLA group and are supporting their wives to save in the VSLA groups. If we move to the next slide, I'd like to give 2 short examples that reflect instances where we have, as AgDefco, have encountered social norms that created barriers for women in particular. So firstly, in 2016, AgDefco conducted a gender study across its portfolio. And one of the interesting findings in northern Ghana was that although women reared guinea fowl and did all of the work, all guinea fowl was being sold by men. And this is because of a social norm that women are not allowed to be seen transacting in the marketplace, as this is seen as a man's task. The gender study went on to recommend to develop a women's cooperative that would sell guinea fowl to buying agents, and this would be seen as socially acceptable because it would be an entity making the transaction as opposed to individual women selling something in the marketplace. Secondly, at an in-grower scheme that we set up in northern Ghana, it became clear that women farmers were falling behind their male counterparts because they could not command sufficient farm labor to help on their plots at crucial times. And this appeared to be due to a weaker social network among women, which meant that family and neighbors preferred to work on men's plots and then did not have enough time to also work on women's plots. And we are now speaking to our team on the ground to find solutions that will work in the local context. And we've considered several options, including establishing a childcare facility, linking women to hired labor on credit, or organizing women in the community to work on all women's plots. But none of these solutions is ideal, and we're still discussing the best way forward, as this is something we only recently discovered. So although there are no direct outcomes to report yet, these examples do highlight the importance of considering social norms when designing business models, whether it's through a smallholder outgrower or in-grower scheme. So now I've only touched on a fraction of the work that AgDefco and its smallholder development unit have done on gender. But if we go to the next slide, I've listed a couple of publications, and I encourage everyone to download and read them, which all of these describe interesting lessons learned, and they share successes and challenges in empowering women. In particular, I've included a practical guide at the bottom to develop inclusive outgrower schemes. And this is designed for agribusinesses to help develop them in an inclusive scheme using 3 simple steps. So all of these images are hyperlinked, and they'll take you to the relevant online publication, and they will be made available to you after the webinar. So on that note, I would like to thank you for your time and attention, and I'd be happy to take your questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you, Jasmine. Since we're short on time, I'm just quickly going to turn it to Katie from Root Capital. Katie, you should be able to speak and mute yourself.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. Just a quick thanks to FinEquity and the Learning Lab for putting together this webinar. I'll start. I'm Katie Nave from Root Capital. I'll first start by providing a very brief overview of Root Capital and our approach to gender inclusion for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, to provide a little bit of context for my examples. Next slide. Root Capital invests in the growth of small and growing agricultural businesses, each of whom works with hundreds, if not thousands, of smallholder farmers so that they can strengthen rural livelihoods. We work in over a dozen countries in Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia. And we call these businesses engines of impact. Not only do they provide access to markets for smallholders, often paying above market prices and wages, they also provide critical farm inputs and also invest in their communities. We provide businesses loans as well as targeted capacity building services. Next slide. Our Women in Agriculture initiative is our organizational-wide strategy to increase gender inclusion across the agricultural value chain. It has 4 parts. We seek out and invest in agricultural businesses that are inclusive of women or that are working towards greater gender inclusion. We cultivate, which is provide women with financial and agricultural training so that they can thrive and grow their careers. We work in partnership, this is the innovation piece, we work in partnership with agricultural businesses and women smallholders and employees to create new products and services and innovations in agriculture. And then on the Amplify side, we do things like this webinar to help make the case, the business and the social case for investing in women in agriculture. Next slide. Crucial to our approach is that it's centered around our belief that women hold diverse and important roles in agriculture, whether as farmers or agri-processors, middle managers, agronomists, or other hidden influencers, or as leaders and entrepreneurs. And we work with women at each of these stages. Next slide. To date, we've invested almost $260 million in 165 gender-inclusive businesses and 65 women-led businesses. Together, they've reached 420,000 women farmers and 11,000 women employees. And right now, gender-inclusive businesses make up almost 50% of our portfolio, and women-led make up about 16%. Next slide. So I'll speak specifically about our work related to Pathway 4 that Clara and Anne presented, that is transition for women to formal enterprise or formal employment. As Clara and Anne pointed out, women face barriers to professional growth and formalizing their businesses. At Root Capital, we think it takes right fit financing, training, and cultural shifts all together in order to address those barriers. Go ahead to the next slide. Our approach starts with working with businesses to diagnose barriers to gender inclusion within the business. We provide training to businesses to help them not only identify the barriers in their businesses, but also to understand what we call gender intelligence, to understand and create potential solutions. We support businesses and women smallholders and employees in a co-creation process so that to identify ways in which to address those barriers within the business. And then we finance and support the ideas that came out of these co-creation processes, and then use these interventions not only to bring about more gender equity within the business, but also to demonstrate their importance and thereby shift norms. Go ahead to the next slide. One example of our work that helped create or shift norms within the coffee industry in Peru was a project with a coffee cooperative client of ours in Peru. They had a strong yet under-resourced association of women smallholder producers. Root Capital provided these women coffee producers entrepreneurship training, as well as financing for a roaster and equipment to package their own coffee. The women launched their own brand of women-only produced coffee, which they're now selling to international buyers. This was an opportunity for these women to not only generate a new income source that added value to their coffee production, but also proved the importance of investing in women entrepreneurs. We found that it actually changed cooperative attitudes on the role that women can play within coffee, whereas prior the Women's Association was rather siloed or sidelined. The business, the cooperative, in identifying and seeing firsthand the role that women can play when given the right resources, added seats for the Women's Association to their board of directors, and also invested in the women's business. Next slide. The woman you see in the front here is Patricia Rodriguez. She's the president of the Women's Association, and you can see all of the women participating in the association holding up their different brands of coffee. And a quote here from Patricia was, "To develop our own roaster had been a dream since 2017. Now that we're business leaders, we're moving forward. As president, I even had the opportunity to visit buyers in France and feel proud to see people in other countries drinking our coffee and to know where the opportunities to export coffee produced and roasted by women." Go ahead to the next slide. Following this project, we hosted a post-project workshop where we brought leaders together from this business, Santiago Palomar, as well as 5 other businesses we did similar interventions with. We brought them together in a workshop, a 2-day workshop, to discuss lessons learned and next steps, and most importantly, how important these interventions were in not only the operations of the business, but also in strengthening the role of women. As you can see here in the bottom right-hand corner, this is a photo of the leadership from these 6 businesses, speaking about the fact that empowering women to start their own businesses and providing them space to take up these entrepreneurial activities actually supported the business and shifted norms within the business to identifying and understanding the roles, the important roles that women hold as part of the formal enterprise. Go ahead to the next slide. Another example is a project that we did with a macadamia nut business in Kenya. This business, which employs mostly women, found one of the largest barriers to both the business's success and the success of the women employees was the need for these women to balance the demands of the workplace as well as the demands at home. Women constantly had to leave work to care for their children because they had no child care support as they grew their careers. This was identified through the business's diagnostic process. And as a result, the business, in collaboration with its women employees, decided that the best approach to support to address that barrier was to create a child care center. So Root Capital financed a daycare center for women employees' children, which the business shared the cost of by funding the staff at the daycare center. We found not only did this, we conducted an evaluation. Oh, go back to the previous slide, please. We contracted an evaluation of this project and found that not only did the business help give women peace of mind and allow them to stay in their jobs on a day-to-day basis, but also in their careers in the long term, it also reduced turnover and absenteeism and increased employee loyalty, showing a win-win for both the women who work within the business and the business itself. As part of the co-creation process, including the diagnostic process, the business identified not only the potential for the daycare center, they also identified other things that the business could do to increase gender inclusion and improve the operating of the business. And this includes the business's first maternity leave policy. They created a policy that allowed women to leave to have and take care of children and return to the business in a role and hours that worked for them in their new lifestyle. Go ahead to the next slide. Here you can see what the business and the female business employees said themselves. One said, "I have less stress now. At other companies, you'd leave if you got pregnant, but here we have job security and aren't worried about losing our positions." Another said, "I don't have to go home to check on her," being her daughter, during the day, which can be a 40 to 60-minute walk. I'm able to spend more time at work now because I can easily check on her from here. Next slide. These are just a few of the examples, like Jasmine, just a few of the examples at Root Capital that we're doing to work with agricultural businesses to help bring about changes in norms to support greater gender inclusion throughout agriculture. To learn more about our work, you can visit our website where you can find research reports and issue briefs, as well as our blog and Women in Agriculture reports and updates. With that, thank you everyone for participating, and I'll turn it over to the Q&A now.
Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Jasmine, Clara, and Annie for those really insightful presentations. I have a few questions for you. We get more questions from our participants. So, Jasmine and Katie, maybe I'll start actually with you as institutions that are focusing on women in agriculture. Could you talk about why, as an institution, you decided that it was a priority to focus on addressing some of the underlying normative barriers that you just highlighted? And were there any internal hurdles you had to face as institutions to get buy-in?
Great.
Yeah,
Shall I
I'm
start?
happy.
Or
Oh, go ahead, Jasmine.
yeah, great. So I think firstly, it's important to note that changing social norms does not fall within AgDevco's mandate as such, and hence we do not aim to disrupt them, but we try to work around existing social norms to ensure that the entire household benefits from, for example, the SDU support, which is what we call farming as a family business. Because women smallholder farmers contribute significantly to farm labor, and this is often unacknowledged, and land often being held by men, we often see that men are the ones being invited to trainings while women are doing most of the work. So it's really important to make sure that they are also being reached through any initiatives. And we notice that social norms or barriers may be preventing women from participating in training due to the way that trainings are designed, often not taking into account women's time, literacy, and mobility constraints, and just assuming that men will pass on the knowledge. And of course, there's also plenty of research demonstrating that men and women make very different decisions on how to spend the income. And generally, women's spending habits favor the household more by spending relatively more in healthcare and education and food as opposed to items such as alcohol. So to note at an institutional level, AgDevco developed a gender strategy in 2016, and of course recognizes the importance of creating positive outcomes for both women and men. And as I mentioned, although we're a private investor and it's not our main focus, we do really see this as an integral part of the success of our investments, mainly from an ESG perspective, but also from an impact perspective. We've also signed up to SDG 5 on gender equality, and as mentioned, the SDU has an explicit target to reach a particular percentage of female beneficiaries. So we, as AgDevco, work together with a gender expert to help us mainstream gender into our investment process. Because one of the hurdles, internal hurdles that we face was that investment teams already had a lot on their plates and then also needed to consider additional gender questions and checklists. And we created a toolkit that they could reference. But by mainstreaming it into the existing process, we reduced the burden on teams. And that was I think that was a main hurdle for us to address. We also conducted training for all staff to ensure that everyone understands how to conduct gender-sensitive due diligence. And yeah, to note also, there's also very strong buy-in from management, and that is quite key to get any gender initiatives through. We've developed, for example, objectives and KPIs, and we report on these periodically to the AgDevco board. And in that way, we really ensure accountability and progress on our gender strategy.
Great, thanks. Katie?
Yeah, so at Root Capital, we launched the Women in Agriculture initiative after identifying not only the important roles women play in agriculture and the barriers they face, but also in recognizing the role that agricultural businesses can and do play in leveling the playing field for women. And as with all of our work, in particular for the Women in Agriculture initiative, our effort to increase gender inclusion, we recognize that change from within, or beginning with the clients that we work with, was necessary to increase gender inclusion within their value chains and their communities, given the role that these businesses have. And that was especially true in the traditionally male-dominated crops that we work in, like coffee and cocoa. We know that our clients are change agents in their communities, and as promoters of gender inclusion, we found that they can have real influence. In terms of internal hurdles, there haven't so much as been hurdles as learnings. Internally, we've had strong champions for this work at all levels. We've worked in parallel to increase gender equity at Root Capital in parallel to doing so with our client businesses. Today, we've got over half of our staff and over half of our executive leadership team are women, as well as the chair of our board. But of course, there have been lots of learnings. This is first that gender inclusion can't be a siloed or a side program, but it needs to be integrated into all we do. For example, we've learned through our advisory services, our training programs for businesses, that it's important that they think of gender as an integral or mainstreamed piece of their work, and that gender exclusion is actually a risk to the business. And so therefore, we don't provide only one-off gender sensitization or gender intelligence trainings for businesses, but rather we incorporate it into all the services that we provide them. So for example, from the beginning, when we do a diagnostic with a business to understand what are their training needs on financial management and governance, we also use a measure of gender inclusion to understand where the client's at and how to best meet them there and improve gender inclusion within the business.
Great, thank you. We have a question about, do you partner with financial institutions? I assume you partner with agribusinesses and provide the financing yourself, am I right? Katie?
That's right, at Root Capital. Yep.
Okay, and AgDevCo has a similar model, if I'm not wrong.
Correct, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'm sorry. I have a question for Annie, and I realize we're running out of time. So if there are additional questions, if people want to type it in their chat, we will follow up on those questions along with the recording and the presentation. So Annie and Clara, you'll get the final word. And the question for you is around the role of technology in increasing women's opportunities in rural transition pathways, especially given that use of technology is often gendered in itself. So if you can comment on that and then wrap it up for us.
Sure, thanks. I think that's a great question. We do tackle the digital technology in our deep dive a little bit. I think we'll all agree that technology has a really immense potential. It can help women work around some of the more stubborn constraints that they face, like limited time and mobility, and also, as one of the examples from AgDevCo presented, they tend to have lower literacy skills. But I think what we've found, at least, is that the reality is that technology hasn't really changed the game as much as we might have hoped. And there's a couple of reasons for that. On the demand side, I think we see low uptake primarily because, first of all, women tend to have lower levels of access to mobile phones. They also lack digital literacy, and there's also a bit of a lack of trust when it comes to new technology. And then on the supply side, we're not seeing a huge number of viable business models yet, which means that providers are really focusing on those customer segments that are most likely to be profitable, and that's not usually rural women. So I think our perspective or our position is that unlocking the full potential of technology for rural women is going to involve adapting services and going through channels that are more women-centric and adapted to those constraints that we outlined in our deep dive. And also it's going to require building women's digital skills. I think we would caution against seeing technology as a silver bullet. There is no silver bullet here. Ultimately, it comes down to also taking into account the broader structural constraints that are at the core of the digital gap. And I think we're already starting to see that this overemphasis in our sector on technology can actually lead to an increase in the digital gender divide. So I think that's our position right now. But yeah, I'd love to hear if others, Jasmine and Katie, if you have other perspectives on that.
I think it's a very valid point, just to chip in quickly. So indeed, when you are using new technologies, it's important to also improve digital literacy. But of course, there's also a trade-off to be made between whether you're going to reach a particular segment of your supply base, so whether you're going to reach female smaller farmers by traditional extension services, or whether, for example, with video training, you're addressing some of the barriers and in that way are actually reaching them. But to get to your point on is digital technology really the way forward? Well, as I mentioned, it's very important to also have boots on the ground and to make sure that you combine digital technologies with someone that's there to answer questions, to explain how the technology is working, and to test whether farmers are understanding the content. So yeah, I think technology definitely has great potential, but that doesn't mean that there's no room for traditional extension services. It needs to be a combination of both.
Great, thank you so much. I realize we're over time, so I'm going to wrap this up for now. Some of you will see polling questions about the webinar, so please be sure to answer so that we know how you did. I would like to thank all our speakers again for their time and sharing their work. I think it was very useful to hear both the model, the framework, as well as some examples of how institutions are trying to address women along those transition pathways. And thank you to everybody who attended this webinar. As I said at the beginning, we will share the recording, the materials, and the links to some of the resources in an email that will go out. Thanks again, and have a good rest of your day. Bye, everyone.